There's something most of us share without ever being taught. It's an unspoken sense of how people should behave when something terrible happens. We expect certain expressions, certain silences, certain kinds of pain. And when someone's response doesn't match that internal picture we carry, something in us notices. We can't always name it, but we feel it. Today, I want to talk about what psychology says about that feeling in the David Anthony Burke case and why it matters more than we realize. Welcome to the Psychology of True Crime with me, RC. Most people think the hardest part of a case is the evidence, but I've found it's the behavior around the evidence that keeps people up at night. Not what was done, but how someone talked about it, how they carried themselves, what they showed, and what they didn't. And in the case we're discussing today, that gap between what people expected to see and what they actually saw is exactly where the question begins. Here's something I want you to hold on to. As we go through this case, behavior doesn't lie, but it also doesn't tell us the whole truth. What it does is raise questions. And the uncomfortable thing about questions in a case like this one is that psychology can explain how they form without being able to answer them. That's what we're sitting with today. Before we go further, and this matters, I want to be able and be clear about what this is and what it's not. This is not a verdict. It's not an accusation. Guilt and innocence belong in a courtroom. What we're doing here is something different. We're looking at behavior. We're asking, what does psychology actually tell us about why certain patterns stand out? Why do some people respond and it feels off to observers, even when nothing illegal has been established? That's the lens we're using today, and I think it's an important one. In the case involving Celeste Rivas Hernandez and David Anthony Burke, much of the public focus has centered not just on facts, but on how those facts have been communicated, how a story has been told, what emotions has or has not been present in the telling. And that's significant because when something serious unfolds, we don't just process the words people say, we read everything around them: the hesitation, the tone, the posture, the things that seem almost too composed. And when that experience of observation creates discomfort, I want us to understand why. Not to assign meaning, but to understand the mechanism. Let me ask you a question. What does a childhood with very limited social interaction actually look like from the inside? Because from what David Burke has shared publicly, his early years included homeschooling, restricted peer contact, and very structured, controlled environment, including limited exposure to music and social settings. And I want to be precise here because this is where psychology gets nuanced. None of that determines who someone becomes. Let me say that again because it's important. Developmental context is not destiny, but it does shape the lens through which someone learns to move through the world. When social input is limited during formative years, certain things develop differently, such as social calibration, the ability to read a room, to mirror appropriate emotions. That's learned through repetition, through being around other people, through getting things wrong and adjusting. When that process is compressed, what you could sometimes see in adulthood is a response pattern that feels rigid, contained, not necessarily because of intent, but because control became the most familiar tool. And here's where it gets important. Sometimes what looks unusual is simply unfamiliar development. The behavior that reads as strange to an observer might be the only behavioral vocabulary that person has ever had access to. So, What about Celeste? Because you can't understand an intersection without looking at both roads. From what has been shared publicly, Celeste, her early life included instability, including running away at a young age in the Lake Elsinore area in California. And if you know anything about early attachment theory, you know that that kind of instability leaves a mark too. It shapes attachment patterns, risk tolerance, how someone navigates movement between environments, physical and emotional. And so, when you look at this case, you're not looking at one person's psychology. You're looking at two very different developmental paths meeting at a single point in time with very different tools, very different patterns. And that intersection is often where complexity lives. I want to pause here because I think this next part is the part that most people need to hear. Background explains context, it doesn't determine behavior. Those are two different things, and confusing them is one of the most common mistakes people make when they try to analyze a case from the outside. A difficult childhood is not a confection. An unusual communication style is not evidence of guilt, and a composed demeanor under pressure is not the same as indifference. What psychology asks us is to do it slower. Sit with the complexity before we reach the conclusion. Now, here's where people's attention tends to shift in cases like this, and I want to walk you through why. Under stress, memory fragments. That's not unique to criminals. That's human neuroscience. We confuse timelines. We leave things out. We remember emotions better than we remember sequences. That's normal. And this is the part that matters, when inconsistencies begin to shift over time, when the story doesn't just evolve but seems to reorganize itself, that's when observers start to focus, not because inconsistency proves anything, but because the pattern of inconsistency can feel different from the facts. And then there's the question people always come back to: where is the emotion? We have a shared expectation. When something devastating happens, we expect to see it on the person's face, in their voice, in the way they hold their body. When that is absent and it's contained, short answers, measured tones, limited expression, we register that as a mismatch, even if we can't explain why. And what psychology tells us is that this reaction to the mismatch is valid. We are wired to read emotional expression as a form of truth telling. So when it's absent or controlled, our instinct flags it. The question is whether our instincts are being asked to do more than they're designed to do. The same thing applies to how a story is told. Repetition, precision, tightly controlled details in some context, that's a sign of someone who has rehearsed. In other words, it's a sign of someone who processes information by creating structure around it, especially under pressure. The challenge for observers and for investigators is figuring out which one they're looking at. And sometimes the honest answer is you cannot know from the outside, not with certainty. And that uncertainty is what makes cases like this one so hard to sit with. And I think that's ultimately what draws people into cases like this one. It's not just the search for answers, it's the discomfort of realizing that behavior, even behavior that feels telling, doesn't always translate cleanly into meaning. That two people with very different life paths can meet in a moment, and that psychology that shaped each of them can complicate every question that comes after. Understanding behavior is not the same as knowing what happened, and sometimes the most honest thing we could say is that we're sitting with something unresolved, not because we haven't looked closely enough, but because some things are genuinely complex, and complexity deserves more than a quick conclusion. David Burke is in jail awaiting a trial unless he pleads it in this case, but as of now, he is presumed innocent until proven otherwise. I want to know what stood out to you in today's discussion. Drop your thoughts in the comments because these conversations are always richer when you're in them. And I'll see you in the next one.